All right, well, welcome. Thank you for spending your morning with us, your late morning, late soggy morning. Let's just jump right into this. Dean and I are going to talk to you about planning, forecasting your medical equipment. You know what? I'd do better if I click.
Oh my.
I'll give it back to you at your part. I promise. I'll give it back to you. Okay, so let's jump into this. And what are we going to try to cover today? We're going to try to run through a lot of this fairly quickly so we have time for some questions and some dialogue, because I'm hoping that I will learn a few things from you guys as part of this presentation. So we'll talk about the who and the why. Who are we and why are we here? What is tech forecasting and planning? What are we talking about? Because sometimes the semantics get switched around. People use words indiscriminately. We'll talk about the process of getting there. You don't have to leap to the perfection in one step. You can have a really methodical path. And obviously, as I said, we'll try to save some time for a Q&A. So, Dean, who are you?
Oh, well, basically, I am a 40, well, this year in August will be 40 years as a BMET, which is a biomedical equipment technician. I'm a certified BMET. I'm also a certified healthcare technology manager with a bachelor's degree in business from Oregon State University. And I'm an avid fly fisherman. So I go around the country during the summer fly fishing in places that are remote. I try to get away from people.
Very good. So I am Carol Davis Smith. My first career was a student athlete. I was fortunate enough to play D1 field hockey on a really bad team, but it was great fun, learned lots of things, got to learn lots of things, but I, like so many D1 athletes, went pro in something else. I have education experience as a clinical engineer. And probably one of the most memorable lessons my bosses taught me at the beginning was that my job was really to build bridges between the technical expertise that I bring to the table, the clinical expertise that I serve, and the administrative business aspects of healthcare, and try to pull those together. All right, so that's who we are. And we're here because we believe that forecasting medical device needs, replacements, new technologies, augmenting technologies is incredibly important. I would say especially in today's healthcare economics, but quite frankly, this has been a real need for probably a decade or two. I personally have been intimately involved in this work for at least 25 years, and I think we probably have at least that many more years to really get this in place. And mostly, it also, the other reason is that for you, it can become a roadmap for planning. You're not having to hope and wish and all of that, and it can create avenues of conversation and collaboration and progress in your organization. So we want to make sure that that at the end of the day, it's not just an exercise, but it's something that actually drives value for your organization. So to that, what is tech forecasting or equipment planning, capital planning? All of those sorts of terms are used here. What Dean and I are going to focus on today is at the very front end of this. It's really forecasting. It's not the actual procurement of the devices or implementation, but it's really forecasting out over multiple years. What do we need? Do we need to upgrade? Do we need to replace? Do we need to reallocate? Are there new technologies coming in? What is it that we need to forecast out over the next 3 to 5 years? And we want to balance. This is a cornerstone of my personal practice, which is balancing, not just, I'm an engineer, so I love all the toys, right? I love toys. But when I interact with clinicians, I want to understand what it is they're trying to do. What is the type of patients they see? What are the care models that they have? What are the operational workflows they have? What are the barriers they have? Because we can go to the closet and find all kinds of toys, but let's find out what it is we really need to do first. We get those things matched up, and then we can talk about what are the business financial aspects, that what are those, as I like to say, what are those engineering constraints that I need to factor in when it comes to the business and the financial aspects. Knowing what it's not is just as important. This is not a wish list. This is not your, here's what I want for Christmas or Hanukkah or my birthday or whatnot. This is not whack-a-mole. Like, I mean, so many organizations replace things only when things are on fire, blood spraying, you know, you've got a catastrophic event. But if you can plan for it, you can avoid the vast majority of those. Okay. Dean and I were talking about it one day, about how do we model out that you don't have to just leap into the super complex immediately. And we really sort of ended up on this analogy of a pyramid. So come along with us to the desert, where we start, of course, on the desert floor. I come from Phoenix, and the desert can be a dark place, right? Especially in the shadow of a monolithic feature like a pyramid, right? It's dark and foreboding, which is often much like the capital process in our organizations, right? There's not a lot of clarity. There's little to no trust. Everybody's out for their own kind of thing. You wonder whether there's a strategy 90% of the time. And things might happen, but to use the word success might be a stretch. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be totally reactive, right? It can be a program by taking steps, methodically thinking, actually taking a strategy to building your forecasting and ultimately your capital planning process. So let's actually get ourselves on the base of the pyramid, right? Things start to lighten up and we're going to set a strong foundation. Any good program builder, any good engineer knows you got to have a good foundation. Like for your home, right? If it's not built on a good foundation, first big win, there it goes. So what is that? What are those foundational elements? I'm a huge proponent of process. Process is dependent on policy. Policy is the rules, right? That's the rules of the organization, the rules of the road. Process is the big picture of how we're going to do it. And procedurally, we look at the individual steps, right? So you have to have a framework. This is often referred to as governance in your organization. You need to have some governance. You need to have these pieces in the foundation. You need some basic data. What do you have? Let's start with that. What is the equipment? Just listened to Lonnie a few minutes ago, earlier this morning. She's absolutely right. So many places don't even know what equipment they have, right? You may know in your department, but if you're part of a larger imaging team, maybe it's across multiple facilities, you may or may not have any idea what's truly in your imaging organization, much less the larger organization. Ultrasound is an excellent example of that. They're related to rabbits. They propagate everywhere when you're not looking. But when you're at the base, you don't want to try to take on everything. Take on one or two things that you understand well, okay? Don't try to cook the whole elephant, to use that analogy. Pick one or two things, and since we're at ICE, and because imaging is big dollars, it's always at the forefront of people's minds, start there. It's something that you're comfortable with. It's something you know well. All right, so I don't want to read all of this, but basically, you got to find your data, you got to analyze it, you're going to make some recommendations, you're going to talk to your clinical colleagues, or if you're like Dean and myself from engineering, we're going to talk to you, our clinician partners, right? Well, hopefully, we'll refine our recommendations based on that. We'll engage some financial stakeholders, and we'll start prioritizing. Very basic sort of process. Remember, this is the basic one. This is what we're going to work off of as we move forward. Your resources, certainly you need to understand are the people that you're talking to, are these influencers or decision makers? I think we skip over this. I know I did early in my career. I didn't understand. Somebody was telling me something and I thought they could make the decision and they could not, right? And some people play multiple roles, right? Your imaging director may make decisions for your department, but when it goes upstream to the larger capital process, they probably become an influencer. So understanding that some people have dual roles, but where do those play out is very, very important. And then understanding, even if you don't have direct contact, understanding who has the ultimate decision-making capability in your organization is incredibly important. Okay. So specifically at the base, what are you looking at? Two systems of data, nuts and bolts kind of thing. Your CMMS, for those of you that may not know what CMMS, computerized maintenance management system. Dean and I are old enough to remember when we did this on paper, so that's why the computer part is interesting to us. But it's just sort of a term that's a legacy term that we apply to the software system, the program that manages the inventory, the physical inventory. It also, it's like an EMR for medical devices, right? It captures maintenance history. When was it born into the organization, aka delivered on the dock kind of thing? When was it installed? When did it get immunized? Scheduled maintenance, PM. When did it get a procedure done? Corrective maintenance. So you can kind of think of it as an EMR for the medical devices. On the financial side, you need to understand depreciation schedules and capital thresholds. Capital thresholds, I put in now because early in my career, I thought there was one. If it's over $5,000, it's capital. Oh, wait. When you start understanding your whole process, you realize there are different tiers. Yes, everything over $5,000 in our organization is capital. Some are at 2, depending upon how who your financial leadership is, right? What your financial strategy is. But let's just use 5 for. In other places, it may jump to 100,000 or $500,000 is the next tier, and then everything over 5 million or something to that effect, right? Understanding where those tiers are is important in terms of you developing your sense of direction as you build out a program, not a reaction, but a program for forecasting your equipment. Okay, so just visually to help this all stick, at the base, you're going to use the basics. What do I know about the age of my equipment, and has it, from my CMMS, can it still be supported, right? First off, is it still made? Is it still supported by the OEM, the maker? And can your in-house program, or maybe if you have a third party, can they continue to support the equipment you need to deliver care, right? But then from the clinical side, we're still kind of looking at clinical preferences, right? We haven't gotten too sophisticated there yet, but at least we want to know what are the preferences, basic needs. And then, is this darn thing depreciated or not? When you try to replace something that's not depreciated, the finance department explodes, right? That is just no bueno. So understanding where it is in its financial life is incredibly important. Okay. So if we step up and we get about to the midpoint halfway, let's get more sophisticated, okay? We want to create greater transparency and greater trust. So we have all the things we had before, but we're going to use some more advanced data. We're going to get deeper into this, and we're going to use more sophisticated analytics. And maybe at this point, we want to look at a couple of categories together. So starting with imaging, maybe we want to add the ORs, surgical services, because they use our imaging stuff so much, right? We're in there with them all the time. So that might be a good place to partner up as we're becoming more sophisticated. Process. All right, the blue in the slides really show, wait, we're getting smarter about this. Let's shift a few of these process steps around. Let's go engage with our clinical and financial stakeholders to begin with. What do my clinical people really need? Are your devices doing what you need them to do? One of the examples that popped in the last year in mammo, right? There's new reporting requirements, right? Can your system do that, or is this now something you have to manually bolt on to make sure you meet those requirements, right? How does that impact your gear? Do you need to replace the gear? Do you need to upgrade it? What do we need to do, right? I need to know what are your clinical requirements. Or maybe you have a new type of patient. I had a client recently that was, they really needed to do something with their pediatric capabilities in imaging because all of their patients were being shipped out. I'm like, that's, some of them, yes, not all of them, right? So that's a clinical capability they did not have that they needed to focus on. And what's the financial environment right now, right? Do we even have money to spend, right? What's finance thinking? Are we changing from buying to leasing? What's our financial strategy? Let's get that information and start moving that into our foundation rather than after the fact. Pretty much the rest of it goes as we did at the base, except that ideally our recommendations, our initial recommendations are more refined, right? They're more thoughtful, they're more strategic. And we begin building a formal business case. Again, I think Lonnie gave a great example of that in her previous presentation. I would encourage you to look at that. This is where we start building the case. We're forecasting we're going to need this in a year or 5 years. Here's kind of the business case, the clinical why, the technical why, and the financial why that goes into that business case. And of course, we talked a little bit about utilization. That's where we're going to get actually a lot more sophisticated. We're going to start trying to figure out how to use utilization now. This is harder than I ever thought, right? I keep saying, well, how do we get paid? If nobody knows how many we did, how in the world are we getting paid, right? So that actually is going to take some work. You may find yourself hanging around the midpoint or so of the pyramid for a while, because finding these more difficult data elements to factor in, again, back in history, had clients that said, I need more of these. And we said, well, let's look at your utilization, and went on quite the adventure trying to find it. And what we learned is hours of operation. We had one client that closed every day for 3 hours around lunch. I was like, what? We had other people who the way they scheduled meant that they lost lots of opportunities to use the equipment, that they could have, they could have scheduled things differently. So it's really understanding that utilization and digging into it with the clinician. I don't want to do that. I want to be the one that asks questions. Why do you do it this way? To help them think through. But I'm not the expert on clinical operations. I'm just the partner to get there.
And as an example to that, something I discovered at our organization recently, there are cases where they're getting flat reimbursements for procedures, and it's not based upon the utilization of the equipment. So it's hard to pull that information out and see what is the cost for the equipment in that precision.
Right, and anybody that's interested in kind of the technical backdoors to that, you can talk to Dean and I later. It's not easy, but there are backdoors to get to that, because if this country moves to a more value-based contracting reimbursement sort of structure, it will be more about, here's $100 to take care of this patient this year, and we're going to have to go into more of those backdoors to get this sort of utilization data for staffing or equipment forecasting and a whole host of things. So fear not, there are ways. So again, we're just going to continue to enhance. More sophisticated on the technical side, let's dig into that maintenance history. In the base, we just want to know, is it still made, and does the OEM still? But let's look at the maintenance history. How often does it fail? What kind of failures does it have? Could I maybe reduce those failures if I did my scheduled maintenance or my PM differently? Could I, or is this thing just reaching its okay? It's just time, right? Or maybe the clinician feels like it's not up enough, doesn't have enough uptime. We need to look at the maintenance history and say, does that substantiate it? If not, then we need to understand, why do you feel like this is down, right? I need to ask that question and figure that out. And then get smarter on the funding process, right? When are things approved? You talked a little bit about this, Lonnie, or implied it. Just because something's approved does not mean your funds get allocated immediately. Where does it fall in the allocation sequence as well? And is it part of the quote unquote routine capital? Is it part of IT capital? Is it part of construction capital? I've seen way too many organizations, been part of way too many organizations where we either double dipped or did not dip at all because we thought the other person had it, right? So getting involved. So you can see how as you go up the pyramid, you're getting more involved and embedded into these larger processes outside of your department to be able to support the work you need to do in the imaging world. All right, Dean. Well, and again, just a visual to help that stick. And Dean, I'm going to turn this over to you and let you speak to an excellent case study, if you will.
Yeah, so one of the things with me is that last 18 years of my career have been spent in imaging only. I worked for Philips Healthcare for 11 and a half years. Then I was at Alina Health before I went to St. Luke's. And when they opened the position that I have, we had just taken over the program, moving it in-house from a third party. So we were really at the bare minimums when I came in. One of the things they hired me to do was technology management and helping them come up with ways to replace medical equipment and score it and evaluate it. So we went through and we leveraged the RHTM team on the front end replacing. What do we need to do? What is the oldest things that we have in this organization that really need to go goodbye? Okay. Our challenge, we're building a brand new hospital attached to our largest facility, and it's sucking up our capital equipment budget. Outline multi-year replacement roadmaps for proactive and predictable capital replacement plans. So my job was to come up with a way that we could list equipment score it for replacement generally, so that we could dive into it at that point in time. We implemented a technology platform to track prioritization plans and move away from spreadsheets. We're not quite there yet. We're trying to use a software called Strata to do this, to link to our CMMS system. We're not there. We ran into some technical difficulties. And then we've created a review cycle for all modalities to continually refresh our plans. And we have a capital planning portfolio management team. I work directly with their director on doing all of these reviews. We take every single imaging modality and we go through it once a year. Actually, we do this twice a year now, so that we understand that as we're going through, we have found that some of our vendors magically have changed some of their end of service dates without us really knowing about it. And we're going in and scanning their databases now every 6 months. So we make sure that we're accurate on it. And then what we have created, because we really, of the hospital that we're building, we have very little funds. So we created a run to replacement type of mentality. But we also understand we schedule this stuff, and then we have a contingency of the stuff that we're concerned about based upon our list. Sure.
What do you mean by run to replacement?
Yep.
Yeah, run to
Exactly.
fail is,
We didn't like the word fail. We said run to replace it. So and that's what they decided to make it. I don't care about the terminology. It's the actual act that's happening. So we came up with this process, and as you can see, we have almost all of our modalities listed there. This is from when we first started, 2022. Then when the next review was going to do, and we started expanding our reviews a little bit. We established a 3-month review period for each modality. So I would take 4 or 5 of these, 3 or 4 modalities, maybe 5 of them, depending on how big the modality is. And I would go in and score them and take a look at in the support and what our service histories were. And I need to quit throwing up there. All of this.
Yeah.
And so basically, we went through and evaluated every one of these, and we did it twice in 2 years. And it really set up a floor for us. We knew coming in 2024, we were starting to build really large lists, especially in our general radiology equipment lists and our rad fluoro equipment lists. We started seeing multiple systems piling on top with the same predicted dates that we would go into service, and we knew we had a problem. So what we did here is we went through and used this type of a scoring methodology. This is our technical assessment portion of our road mapping, and we take a look at all of the cyber issues, and I work with cybersecurity to make sure that we don't have any ongoing cyber issues with these devices, even with some of the older software systems. You know, Windows 7 versus anything else. And we had issues with XP systems, and those were the first things that we went through and targeted. We also use something I developed when I was at Philips. It can be matured a little bit, but basically my notations from my experience and when I was working in helping capital plan for LA County Department of Health Services, where I was a customer service advocate manager, was at 5 years, we were going through the first stage of doing technology upgrades to equipment, obsolescence management. It's a new concept. A lot of people don't understand it. And then we would get through the matured to declining phases, and then here would be the second and then third stages if some vendor is good. It's vendor dependent. Some vendors do obsolescence management, some don't. Okay. When we finally get to the sunset, I found that there were a lot of systems that they were going beyond sunset with. And I found the same thing in our organization when I got there. When I first looked at this, these numbers right here were about 35% between these two alone. That's a lot. When you're talking about expensive devices that need to be replaced, and then we were probably 20 to 25% here. Those ratios didn't make sense to me because I felt it should be more that we had newer equipment in the 60 to 65% range, and it wasn't there. Why? Because simply they didn't have a plan around replacing their medical devices. The user come in, like Carol said, and they just ask for a piece of equipment. They'd go out and negotiate with the vendors, do bulk buys. The one thing they did do great was buy equipment in bulk, but there was no methodology about understanding when the rest of the fleet was needing to be replaced. They just waited for the doctors to go and say, I want a new toy. No, it's not defined by repairs. It's defined by when it came into the organization, when they purchased it. Okay, this is changing for me. One of the things that we now request a new equipment purchase is the FDA 510K letter authorizing the product to be sold and the version of it.
Yeah, that's more a measure of the original equipment manufacturer's product strategy as opposed to our ownership side. Because remember, the product life cycle truly begins on some engineer's drawing board.
It actually begins when they do their alpha and beta testing of the system before they release it for 510K approval through the FDA. But that letter is, and that date is the first date of the initial marketing of the product. So as they release new versions, they still have to have a new 510K because it's upgrading the piece of equipment. So we're trying to figure out how we want to use that information.
Advanced analytics.
Yes. Well, and believe me, this was tough because then we talked about I met with some of our cyber people, and they came up with a conscript. They decided instead of replacing all of these devices that were Windows XP and Windows 7, they simply wanted to segment networks. Cost-effective approach, not necessarily the best approach, okay, but it is a cost-effective approach, and they monitor all of the stuff on this. So they come to me or to my boss and they tell us these are now at very, very high risk. So we upgrade with a scoring mechanism that they need to be replaced. Okay.
Question on that previous slide.
Mm-hmm.
Did your IT department also have something like this in terms of upgrading and cybersecurity?
My cybersecurity is part of my IT department. We actually call our IT department Integrated Health Technologies. Okay, so that's why HTM is side by side with medical applications side of our business. So when we take a look at products, we're not just taking a look at the hardware and the equipment that's going to be used. We are also taking a look at all the software that's going to be affected by the use of those devices.
That's an excellent question, though,
Yep.
because that's not always the case. If you have an in-house biomed department, they may or may not be well connected, to use a pun, with IT. If you have a third-party organization, they may or may not be well connected. But as the clinical leader, I would encourage you to encourage them to get well connected.
Yeah, I would, if I had to score our facility and our HTM department and IHT division, we're in the second tier, in the middle tier, moving to the top tier. But I don't anticipate that we're going to be there for another 3 to 5 years. We still have a lot of things that we need to do. We need to, this does not integrate our clinical equipment right now. Because we have so much of it, it's hard doing it on an Excel spreadsheet. And until we can get better informatics to match up with some of our opportunities that we have in the organization, we have made a decision to leave the clinical side off of this.
That we use a program called Mitigate.
We use those two, and we integrate that information from Mitigate into these decision processes now. We just implemented Mitigate about 2 years ago. But for us, in the direction that we're going, we have a capital equipment planning or a capital equipment approval process that goes through a software called Strata. And we're moving to ServiceNow next year, okay, for our networking strategy. And Strata has told us that they will come up with a way for us to merge everything out of these spreadsheets and out of our CMMS to be able to be, let's say, more proficient at doing what we're trying to do. TMS online. It's
Strata and Mitigate and AIM.
Well, I'll put it this way. AIMS is a much better software than what I have. I've used AIMS in the past.
And in an effort to keep this very vendor neutral, the game plan here, the strategy really needs to have a strategy,
Exactly.
right? To know what the data elements are that you have today, and what are the ones that you want to have tomorrow, and what are the ones that you want to have a year from now, right? And I will say, given my 30 years of working in organizations or with organizations across the country, I've been very fortunate that way. I would say most people are at the midway on the pyramid or lower. Unfortunately, there's a lot of folks still wandering in the desert that we're trying to get to at least the base of the pyramid, right? So fear not, but it really is less about the tool. There's a saying in the medical community about you can give an adequate tool to a stellar surgeon and get stellar outcomes. You can give a stellar tool to an adequate surgeon and you might get adequate outcomes, right? So I'm less concerned. We can figure out how to make the tools work. Honest to goodness, the technology underlying this is the easy part. The hard part are the cultural norms that have to change within ourselves. I really had to move beyond, fortunately I had great mentors, to move beyond just what is it about the devices and what is it, those are just tools again, right? It's what are we trying to do in the health system, but from delivering care to those patients, those millions of people that depend on us to do the right things for the right reasons, right? And so we have to mature in our thinking to be able to do this. And so then really being able to, if you can sort of diagram this, so you can get a napkin out and you can sort of diagram what this process looks like in the inputs and all, back to the visual slides that I showed you, that's probably more important than which CMMS you have, which network monitoring tool you have, all of that, because you can make those things, eventually you can make those work, right? But if you don't have an underlying game plan, you're not going to get any better outcomes regardless of what tool you have. And that's my personal Carol's opinion. This particular slide is super transparent because at the top, it really should be super. When you reach sort of that pinnacle of forecasting, it should be very transparent. You should have lots of trust at this point because you've set the foundation and now you really want to go for that ultra, I really want outside expert input to this. What are outside data sources? Because everything we've talked about today are things that come from inside our organization, right? And we've blended those together and set our prioritization. Now we're going to look outside. We're also going to try to look at what's the overall impact. How many, I don't know, how many of you are actually imaging directors in the room? Do we have any? Okay, our imaging director folks, constantly get beat up because they take all the money, right? Well, maybe it's because they're further up the pyramid. But chances are they get a lot of the money because we're not looking at all of the, our whole organization together,
Holistic.
right? We're not looking holistically. And some of these other places like surgical services may quote unquote own the imaging equipment, right? But it impacts our imaging service delivery and our imaging service line, right? Imaging may be frustrated because the little baby patient monitors they need to make sure the patients are okay while they're getting their studies done don't work, can't find them, whatever, right? Well, it's because we didn't look at this holistically, and we need to prioritize and make sure that we're covering all these bases that are holistic, good word, for delivery of care. So we're just getting more and more sophisticated. The other thing that a colleague of mine did that really, and he did it before they got to the peak, he actually started working on this idea of a core replacement budget at probably midpoint on the pyramid. And I think, Lonnie, you mentioned this too. You guys have achieved this. Having a set aside in your organization that says, we know that this team, and it truly should be a multidisciplinary team that brings us this forecast, we know they're going to bring us this sort of ask for replacement. Let's make sure we have a pot of money set aside so we can tackle at least some portion of that and not get totally behind the curve. Because as Dean said, when he walked into his organization, the meter was way off the mark, right? When I look at organizations today, it is not uncommon for 20% of the equipment to be in the red. That's fine, right? I kind of expect that. But if it's higher than that, I'm really worried about this organization's ability to prioritize and or their financial health, right? So setting that money aside means it doesn't get lost on other things that may be important, but let's find a right way to fund them, or may end up being a really big expensive doorstop. Yes, sir.
But how often does that realistically happen?
This kind of a budget?
Because I've worked with facilities before, we've set aside or started establishing a fund for a 20-year-old picker unit.
Yeah.
That's no longer supported.
Right.
And then of course, we've got this money allocated, we need to replace this machine. CT goes down. We just took that. Not supported.
Right. Now, for the sake of the recording, the example is you got a 20-year-old picker unit that we were planning to save money for, but then when that year comes up, the CT crashes and the money gets reallocated. There's no guarantees here, but I think that's likely to happen earlier in the process of establishing these sort of funds, because just like anything else, we have to practice these behaviors to get it to be muscle memory. The old muscle memory early on in the process is to just throw the money at whatever's on fire and people are screaming about. So there is an organizational maturity that has to occur here. There's also an element of what is the financial strategy of the organization, who sits in that CFO seat, and what is their level of influence and decision making in the organization. So some are very good at it, some of them are really very poor at it.
So remember the slide that I set to where we do all of the modalities for imaging? Okay, we have that mindset with us. So our capital portfolio management team is the head of the multi-dimensional process, and we bring our image community of practice together, but we recognize that that's only about 40 to 50% of our imaging equipment. Ultrasound is the largest space because we carry over 350 ultrasound devices in our organization. Well, that's out in nursing and cardiovascular and all those different sections, right? So we took ultrasound and moved it into one team. We took just the general imaging devices for MR, CT, nuclear medicine, and the general rad fluoro units and general rad units. We put them into one group. Mammography and oncology are two other groups. And so we kind of mixed and matched everybody. So now when we take a look at that, we're ranking that stuff. And we do exactly what Carol says, is we'll budget for equipment, but we also have a contingency budget set for equipment that we didn't budget, but we're sitting there waiting because we're running it to replacement. And if something happens, we'll move a piece of equipment if we have to move a piece of equipment. Everybody gets to buy into this process and understand they may not like that we have to make the decision, but we still have 4 more years until that new building goes live. Once that new building goes live, we can reinfuse. So we know we're getting very, very close now at the 4-year mark.
Yeah, and I want to say too, because we're talking about, you saw in Dean's spreadsheets and the tools that I build for the folks I work with is a multi-year. So I would suggest that in the vast majority, if you are at the midpoint, if you've achieved midpoint on the pyramid, the fact that the CT went down in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, should be anticipated.
Yeah.
If we as the service professionals, the managing the technical life cycle are doing our jobs, we should be able to have some anticipation, because I put out there, look, this thing isn't sold more, it's not supported more, where are we getting our parts from, what's our mean time between failures, what are our other metrics for the health and well-being of this device, right? So we should be able to have some anticipation. Not every case, I agree to that. But if it's out, if we've already said this is going to need to be addressed in year 3 or 4, and it happens in year 2, it's not a total surprise to administration, because if we're looking at this, to Dean's point, every year, or in his case, sounds like twice a year, then we can be updating that. If we had it out in 4 and we see the maintenance metrics slumping off, we should be pulling that forward. This is never, ever a one and done exercise. This is a living document that rolls.
Yeah, ours now is all about information, okay? And we review this, Valerie and I review the statuses on a lot of this stuff almost monthly now. And we will slide equipment up and down based upon some failure rates that I might see, okay? Or from, you know, the need with the clinicians for something that happened with the equipment. But basically, we will keep the capital equipment budget fixed for that year unless we have a device that fails that we just have no alternative.
Yeah.
We had an imaging system at one of my clinics that the overhead tube support system, the cables in it failed. Not the safety cables, but just the cables that take it up and down. It was no longer available. There was one left in the world sitting in Toronto, Canada with Siemens. And it took everything with me working with a third-party company just to get a hold of that system. We were ready to stop 2 other pieces of equipment from being replaced just to get that system up and running because it was a critical piece of equipment. Fortunately, we were able to get it back up and running, and we were in the process of replacing those 2 other systems. Yep. But I was sweating it for a while.
With replacement, since you're only the one left in the world, with replacement, just been a better plan. Because now what do you do now? Well,
but the problem is the 2 pieces of equipment, okay, that were scheduled for replacement before this device were very high priority items. We already had them approved for capital equipment purchase, and they were ready to go to construction. And finance said, Dean, can you repair this system? And I said, I can try, and let me see what I can do. It took us 2 weeks of doing research and getting to that point, and we were able to acquire it. It only cost me $18,000 in repair expense.
So, but this is a really, really good question, right?
It is.
And I had a young clinical engineer ask me something along this line. Kara, while I'm out trying to determine, okay, do you make it or not? That's an easy one for them to answer. But when I asked them, do you still offer parts and service? What if they say, I can offer most of the parts? I said, then they're not supplying parts. Most of only works, what is it, in horseshoes and
Hand
grenades?
grenades and,
Right? Like, no, because then you get into this, there's only one cable on the planet, right? So I think some of this, again, it goes back to where are you in your, this is why the soft part is the hard part, right? You have to make that governance. What is your policy about the definition of end of manufacture, end of service, end of what service I personally can take care of? You have to set those thresholds and then have the governance around them, or you get into these weird, they're political. These are not technological or clinical service. These are political debates that happen in the
yeah,
organization.
and
Hang on, we got one question here.
Okay, how do you view parts are available until they run out?
easy.
Then they're not available.
Well, easy and hard, right?
They're not available.
So
In my opinion.
we just had this happen. I'd never seen this before, but we had a collimator go bad on one of our general rad systems. It was an auto collimator. The vendor didn't supply the collimator anymore. Their solution was to have a manual collimator and downgrade the system. And I went, okay. So I went to our clinicians. I asked them, is this okay? They said, yes. And then I turned to my capital equipment side and my bosses, and I said, the clinicians say this is okay. However, I think we need to adjust our assessment scales. And I said, why? And I said, I think we need to put in a condition to where when we know that the manufacturer no longer has a part, but they have not end-of-life supported the device, that we technically end-life support right then and there, because we know they're going to go in that direction. So that
From
we
the
put it in
OBM,
scales, so
service
we
from
get
the
it
OBM.
on the list, because this equipment wasn't there. We moved it up.
Right.
Just based on that assessment.
How do you proactively do that? I mean, that was a reactive, right? Because you found out about it.
That-
How do you do that proactively?
That's a great question, and
Can I take it?
yeah, if you have an answer to it, because I don't.
I do.
Okay.
I do. And it may be a little theoretical, but I think I'm a living example of
I'm
it.
going to sit down for this one, because
When-
I'm a student now.
I've given you this answer.
You have? Okay.
So your technician staffs don't have time to do this research.
Nope.
It's not their job. They are
Okay.
fascinating individuals to keep the gear up and running, schedule maintenance, corrective maintenance, all this, and a source of unlimited information on what's happening in the real world of care delivery.
That is true.
I function as a clinical engineer. My job is not to repair the equipment. My job is to do this strategic digging. It's to look out and anticipate what is coming. The work I've done for organizations and now in private practice is to go dig for those things. If something is no longer sold, then my job is to say, what is your level of service and support? What are the parts that are available? What does it mean that you can do this until things are gone? Or we can figure it out. I had a supplier who says, we never set a date. We'll support you as long as we can. I'm like, no support. Right?
Exactly.
I mean, but that's my job, is to dig in and to understand the engineering and the technology and the clinical environment. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a radiation oncology technician or an x-ray tech. I'm not a surgeon, but I need to know those environments enough to know that when I suggest that to fix this, I'm going to downgrade your capabilities. As a clinical engineer, that I'm about to go into seizures, right? Because I've spent all my time trying to give you optimal capabilities for the care you want to. And is that going to dump our organization outside of clinical standards of care? That's a joint commission thing too. Guys, it's not all about us.
Nope.
It's mostly about them and meeting clinical standards of care, standards of practice, right? What is it, the HEDIS scores and whatnot, right? I personally would advocate, teach young people, 20-somethings, to be clinical engineers and come into your organization, you don't need 15 of them like you need techs. You need 1 or 2 good ones that dig into this, that understand the technology, understand the clinic, and begin to understand the business side, probably from your mentoring, and do this underlying work for you.
Yeah, she's right. She's talking about this because that's one of the things that I wanted to do at our organization is bring in a couple of young clinical engineers to do this. I don't have time to do it.
So just in the interest of time, to get this all the way done, especially for the recording, for those that can't be here with us, I want to say we circle back to what are the process changes we make. We're going to get more detailed with our operational forecast, and we're going to install a process for monitoring. We built the business case and said it's going to bring this kind of benefit. Did we actually achieve that benefit? That's a circle around that people have been chasing for my whole career. Very few places do that well. But that, I think, is the key to organizational success in the future. Then also some of the external expertise. Some of the insurance companies like the Blues used to, I apologize, I don't know if they still do, they used to have a think tank that did true technology assessment. What is the underlying engineering and technology? What is the clinical purpose? What's it replacing? What is it augmenting? And strategy firms like SG2 that's now owned by Vizient, the group purchasing organization. They look at what is the future of imaging services? What is the direction it's going? Is it going to be continued fee for service? Is it going to be more value based? Is it going to be, are we moving more into these sort of clinical specialties? Are we going to see more of this and less of that? I mean, lots of external information that you can apply, and really at the top of the pyramid, like you're really refining, you're grabbing those things. These are the things that set you apart from the guy down the street, right? From your competition, right? It's available to everybody, but it's how do you use it? Same thing, internal and external benchmarking. Now we're looking beyond our organization, whether it's the maintenance, how are we maintaining the equipment, or maybe we're at least starting with, we have 5 different sites, our 5 sites are comparing. Now we're gonna look outside to other health systems and find benchmarks to how do other organizations work. Same thing on the financial side. What are the financial trends? How do we benchmark against other organizations?
Yeah, we have an agreement with a group purchasing organization. I'm not.
Everybody does.
But our group actually does benchmarkings for us. They come out to us. They bring some of our users in to talk about some of this stuff. That actually talk to me about how we're formulating some of our replacement strategies. And if you have those relationships with your group purchasing organization, I implore you, start using them.
Have those resources already paid for.
Yep.
In most cases, already paid for. Okay, so the thing I want to really bring in here is for the prioritization, you're doing all the things that we did at the lower parts of the pyramid, but you're really looking outside the benchmarks. What are industry norms? Industry norms may or may not be good. You may be factoring them in saying, I'm going against the grain, right? Whether that's on the financial side, the clinical side, or the HTM side, because you know there's a better way. What are the standards of care? Please, please, please don't ever not put that in there, because at the end of the day, it's not about the gear, it's about the patients, right? What are the standards of clinical care that have to be met and upheld and at a minimum met, if not exceeded, right? And all of that then feeds into what's nice to have versus what do we gotta have right now. And sometimes that means you gotta go off plan. But what was it? Was it, what was the one president, which was the president that said, you know, the whole point of a plan is to have a plan so that you're not going in there blind, right? It's not that the plan goes exactly to step, but you have a strategy, you have a thought process, and so you can make informed decisions in the moment when life happens, right? Okay, so where are you guys? Do you have a sense of where you are on the pyramid in your organizations? Lonnie, I know you guys are at least kind of at least in the middle of the pyramid.